I was alone in the detention room, copying sentences in the notebook while the clock seemed to drag. The school was already practically empty, and the only lighting came from the cold lamps in the corridor. Suddenly, I heard slow, well-spaced footsteps echoing outside. I thought it was some employee making rounds, but when I approached the door and looked, the corridor was completely empty. I went back to my seat trying to ignore, but a few minutes later, the steps started again. It was the same rhythm, the same cadence, as if someone was going and coming back very slowly. But every time I got close to the door to check, the sound stops abruptly. This was repeated for almost half an hour, and I began to feel as if whoever was there knew exactly when I was going to look. I sat down again, but this time I was staring at the door, waiting for any sign of movement. The sound started again, lower, almost as if the person was trying not to be heard, but still enough to make me goosebumps. I stood still, motionless, until I realized that the steps were getting closer and closer. The silence returned, and at that moment I realized that the doorknob movented very slowly. I froze. There was no attempt to open, in fact, just that slight turn, as if they were testing if it was unlocked. When I got up the courage and went there, I opened the door hard, and the corridor was empty again, with no sign that someone had passed by. I closed the door and locked, but my mind couldn't accept that it was just coincidence or imagination. I decided to touch my ear to the wood, trying to catch any sound. After a few seconds, I heard something different, a short, almost muffled breath coming from the other side. I walked away immediately, my heart racing. I waited a time that seemed endless before opening again, this time more slowly. The corridor was completely empty, the fluorescent lights flashing slightly. But there was something new, a piece of paper folded on the floor, right in front of the door. I took the paper with hesitation, already feeling my hands sweat. When unfolding, I saw only one sentence written with a blue pen: "Sit and wait." There was no signature, no explanation, and that made me even more nervous. I looked at both sides of the corridor, but I didn't see anyone. I went back into the room and closed the door again, trying to focus on the detention work, but my brain only repeated those words, as if it were some kind of warning or instruction that I didn't want to understand. I kept sitting, but I couldn't pay attention to anything anymore. Silence returned to dominate the corridor, broken only by a slight squeak coming from somewhere far away. I looked at the clock on the wall and realized that there was still almost an hour before the detention ended. Suddenly, I heard footsteps again, but this time faster, as if someone was approaching. I stood still, with my heart racing, watching the door closed. The steps stopped exactly in front of her, and I could swear that I felt a presence on the other side, motionless, as if she was listening to me breathe. I took a deep breath and gave courage to open the door at once, but when I did, the corridor was completely empty, lit only by the cold lights and flashing at some points. I walked a few meters, trying to find any sign of whoever it was, but there was nothing, no sound, no shadow moving. I went back to the living room and closed the door, but I couldn't sit down anymore. With each loop or distant sound, I turned around quickly, hoping to see someone. When the teacher finally came back to release me, I didn't want to explain what had happened. I just got out of there as soon as possible, without looking back. I was alone in the detention room, waiting for the time to end. The teacher who was on duty left to solve something, and said she would be back in a few minutes. Time passed, the clock marked the time to leave, and I started to put my things away. When I tried to open the door, I realized that the handle didn't turn. I found it strange, since they never locked it from the outside. At first, I thought it was a mistake, so I took my cell phone and called my mother to pick me up earlier. The call was completed, but no one said anything. I could hear a slow breath close to the microphone, as if someone was holding the phone close to their face. Before I said anything, the call dropped. I held my cell phone tightly, trying to call again, but now it was out of area, which didn't make sense inside the school. I went to the living room window, but the view overlooked the empty parking lot. No sign of movement, no car coming. The silence of the corridor seemed denser, as if it was muffled even my own thoughts. I started knocking on the door, calling for someone. Minutes passed and nothing. The air was getting heavy, and every snap of the wood or hiss coming from the ceiling made me look up. That's when I noticed something. The small sleg in the door, through which a stream of light from the corridor usually passed, was dark, as if someone was standing there, outside, blocking the light. I took a step back, my heart racing. I called, "Who's there?" but the silence was total. I stood still, trying to hear something, and then came, very weak, almost imperceptible, the sound of a nail scraping on the metal of the handle. It was slow, dragged, as if the person was doing that on purpose for me to realize. I ran to the back of the room and tried to convince myself that it was some kind of stupid prank. But I couldn't take my eyes off the door. The scraping stopped, and a few seconds later, I heard the handle turn very slowly. She clicked low, but it didn't open. I was completely motionless, just breathing through my nose so as not to make noise. After a few seconds, the sound stopped again, and nothing else happened. I took my cell phone with my trembling hand and dialed my mother, just to confirm that she was already on her way. When she answered, it wasn't her voice that I heard. It was just a heavy, slow breath, as if the person was holding the phone very close to his mouth. Before I said anything, the call dropped. I couldn't turn it on again. My phone screen went black and didn't respond. At that moment, my heart shot in a way that seemed like I could hear the blood pulsating in my ears. I looked through the small glass window of the door, but the corridor was completely empty, illuminated only by those cold school lights. I knocked on the door, called, but nothing. It was strange, because I was sure that the caretaker had already passed by there minutes before, and usually he left everything unlocked. I picked up my cell phone again, and tried to call my mother again, but this time the call didn't even complete. I got that horrible feeling that someone was close, but out of my field of vision. I walked away from the door and tried to convince myself that it was just a mistake or a bad joke, but out of nowhere, I heard a metallic noise coming from the corridor, as if something had fallen or been dragged. The sound echoed until it disappeared, and then total silence. I was already sweating cold, and the room seemed smaller and smaller. I looked around trying to find another exit, but there was only the main door and the high windows, locked inside with old locks. That's when my cell phone vibrated with a notification, a message from an unknown number saying only don't call for help. I took a deep breath and tried not to panic, but my hands were already shaking so much that I almost dropped my cell phone. I walked slowly to the door, leaned my ear on the glass, and stood there motionless, trying to pick up any sound. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and I started to think that maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. But then very low, I heard that heavy breath again, as if someone was leaning on the other side. The air seemed denser, and I couldn't convince myself to open my mouth to say something. I took a few steps back, without taking my eyes off the door. I kept mentally calculating if I could break into that old lock if it was necessary. Before I could try, the doorknob turned by itself, slowly, and stopped in the middle of the movement, as if whoever was outside wanted to show me that they could enter at any time. I was completely paralyzed, and the only sound I could hear was my own heart beating hard. With my breathing accelerated, I took my backpack and went to the window, thinking of jumping to the courtyard if necessary. The height was not small, but at that moment it seemed the only way out. I stood there, standing, looking at the corridor through the door slit. The silence had returned, but it was that heavy silence which makes the ears hurt. I could almost feel that someone was still there, standing waiting. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, the doorknob returned to normal position with a dry slap. I waited a little longer before building courage to open the door. When I finally pulled, the corridor was completely empty, illuminated only by the dim lights. I looked both ways, there was no one. But on the wall, next to the door, there was a hand mark made of something dark, as if someone had stood there all the time. I took my things and left as fast as I could, trying not to look back. When I arrived at the main exit, I realized that the gate was open, but I didn't see any employees, no security, nothing. Just that strange silence that seemed to follow me outside of school. When I finally got home, locking every door and window, I kept wondering who would have locked the door from the outside, and especially why. To this day I don't have any answer. I don't know if it was someone trying to play a trick on me, or if there was something much worse happening there. But that breath on the phone still echoes in my head. If it was a person, it was close. Close enough to hear me, and maybe close enough to get in. I was helping to tidy up the teacher's room as part of a volunteer work that the advisor asked me to do after class. It was late afternoon, the building was practically empty, and you could only hear the distant sound of the cleaning team. While I was carrying some materials to the corridor, I passed in front of the cleaning cabinet, that narrow one, which is always locked and only the caretaker has the key. That's when I heard, very low, as if someone was trying not to be heard, my name. Of course, repeated twice. At the time I froze, feeling my heart racing. I approached slowly, trying to understand if it wasn't an impression or some echo coming from somewhere else. I leaned my ear on the door and heard it again, weaker, as if it came from inside. I knew that closet was locked, because minutes before I had seen the key hanging on the board of the team room. I went there, took the key with trembling hands, and when I opened it, the space was completely empty, only cleaning products and a strong smell of disinfectant. I closed the door quickly, with that feeling that something was still wrong. I kept working, but I couldn't stop looking out of the corner of my eye at the closet. After about 10 minutes, while I was arranging some boxes, I heard it again, this time more urgent, almost like a hurried whisper, repeating my name. The sound seemed to come from inside, but with a different tone, as if it were closer to the door. My stomach frosted. I ran there, opened it again without thinking much, and again there was no one. But now something made me stop. One of the cleaning cloths, which was previously folded on the shelf, was on the floor, right in front of the door. I dropped the key in the hallway and left, making up any excuse for the advisor. To this day, whenever I pass through that corridor, I feel a chill as if someone somehow was still inside. While I kept the products in the warehouse, I couldn't get it out of my head. It didn't make sense. I had locked the closet myself and checked that no one was there. When I finished my shift, I passed through the corridor again and saw the closet door slightly ajar. No one was authorized to move there without the key, and she was with the advisor since I returned it. I came close and closed the door slowly, trying not to make noise. At that moment, I felt a breath of cold air coming from inside, as if there was an empty space or passage there. That shouldn't exist. The closet faced a concrete wall. I was never alone in that sector of the school again. I was closing my room to leave when I remembered that I needed to leave a document at the office. It was late afternoon, the building almost all empty, and the corridors were already starting to get that strange gloom of the automatic lights that go out by themselves. I passed in front of the computer room and heard, very clearly, the sound of keys being pressed fast, like someone typing a large text. That made me stop on the spot. It was a very specific sound, and I knew that no one should be there at that moment. I stood at the door for a few seconds, listening. The keys continued to be pressed, without any long pause, as if the person was focused on finishing something. I pushed the door slowly, and the noise stopped immediately. Inside, the silence was absolute. The chairs were all aligned, the cables in place, and the strangest thing, all the monitors were off, without even the waiting LED on. There was no sign of anyone, but I swear I still felt that heavy silence, as if someone had just left. I took a few steps inside, trying to find some explanation. I touched some keyboards to see if they were connected, but nothing happened. The air inside the room was colder than in the hallway, which made me even more uncomfortable. I looked at the background, where the less used computers are, and realized that one of the keyboards had some kind of crooked keys, as if someone had pressed too hard a short time ago. I left the room and stood at the door for a few moments, trying to decide whether to lock it or not. That's when, right behind me, the sound of the keys started again, but this time, I was looking directly inside and saw that no one was sitting at the tables. It was as if the sound came out of nowhere, echoing between the rows of turned-off computers. I swallowed dryly and took a few hesitant steps back inside. The sound stopped as soon as I crossed the door, as if it had been cut. I went through each row, checking keyboard by keyboard, but everything was still off. The silence was so heavy that I could hear my own heart beating. When I bent down to look under one of the tables, I noticed that one of the power cables was disconnected, but still, the sound had come exactly from that computer moments before. I decided to get out of there quickly, but before reaching the door, the keys began to be pressed again, now at a faster and more aggressive pace, as if someone was typing something desperately. But this time, the sound came from several different points in the room, all at the same time. I felt such a strong chill that I let go of the door open and left down the corridor without looking back. When I arrived in the teacher's room, I tried to convince myself that it had some logical explanation, maybe an electrical failure, interference, anything. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. No computer on, no student, and yet that perfectly clear typing sound, multiplied by several corners at the same time. That night, when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about keyboards. I kept wondering what would have appeared on the screen if I had turned on any of those computers at that moment. I didn't go back to school after work, and until today, just remembering, I feel a physical discomfort, as if something had been left unfinished in that corridor. I was doing the routine round at school when this happened. I've been working as a night security guard there for just over a year, and, although I've heard strange stories about the building, I've never been through anything that really made me nervous. That night, it was just after 2 in the morning, and I was in the monitoring room watching the cameras. That's when I noticed something in the image of the corridor on the 3rd floor. A person walking slowly, with his head slightly down, as if he didn't want to be recognized. At first, I thought it was some student who had been trapped or an intruder trying to steal something. I took the flashlight, the radio, and went up immediately. The corridor was completely silent and empty, but to my surprise, on the cell phone screen, which I had connected to the system to monitor the cameras while moving, the figure was still there, standing right in the middle of the corridor. The strangest thing is that, from the image, she seemed to be looking directly at me, even though I couldn't see her with the naked eye. I kept walking slowly down the corridor, sweeping every corner with the flashlight. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm and convince myself that it was just some mistake in the camera system. When I got exactly to the point where, according to the image, the figure was standing still, there was absolutely nothing there. The air, however, seemed colder, and I felt that heavy, almost muffled silence, as if something was watching me. I looked at my cell phone again, and the figure still appeared in the live broadcast, only now it was a few steps behind me. I turned quickly, illuminating the corridor, but I only saw the floor reflecting the light of the flashlight. At that moment, I felt a chill run down the back of my neck and realized that, for the first time at work, I no longer wanted to continue the round alone. I took a deep breath and decided to go back to the monitoring room to check the cameras more carefully. On the way, the feeling that there was something following my steps only increased. It was as if the whole corridor was pushing me forward, forcing me to leave there. When I finally entered the room, I closed the door and looked straight at the camera screen on the 3rd floor. The figure was still there, but now it was no longer standing still. He walked slowly in the direction of the camera, and even without a defined face, he seemed to fix his eyes on the equipment. I adjusted the zoom, trying to understand what I was seeing, and realized that the shoulders and posture were exactly the same as mine. I stood for a few seconds, unable to decide whether to keep looking or turn off the monitor. Then on the screen, the figure stopped again and tilted its head slightly, just like I was doing at that moment. I felt a chill go up my spine when I realized that she was not just walking down the corridor, she was imitating each of my movements. I moved the chair away slowly, without taking my eyes off the camera, and the figure took the same step back at the same speed. The detail that left me paralyzed was realizing that, in the real corridor, where she should be, there was absolutely nothing, but in the images, she was a few steps from the lens, as if she wanted to cross. With my heart racing, I went to the door of the security room, trying to convince myself that it was some kind of interference or failure in the system. When I opened it, the corridor was completely empty and silent. No sound of footsteps, nothing. But when I returned to the chair, the figure on the screen was now closer to the camera, as if it had advanced while I wasn't looking. I pulled the radio and called another security guard to go up. While waiting, the image trembled and was full of static for a few seconds. When it returned to normal, there was no one else on the scene. My colleague arrived, we checked the whole floor together and found no sign of invasion. But since that night, I avoid watching the recordings alone as much as possible. It started as a quiet evening of organization in the school library. I had stayed after work to advance the cataloging work, since the week was busy. The library was silent, with that characteristic smell of aged paper and waxed wood. I was alone, stacking books in the history section, and only the low sound of the air conditioning broke the silence. The fluorescent lights illuminated each shelf corridor evenly, creating an even comforting environment, despite the time. That's when I noticed, in the corner of my eye, that the farthest row went dark. I thought it was just a burning lamp, but a few seconds later, another closer light went out. I raised my head and realized that it was not a random failure. The lights were going out in sequence, as if someone was turning off switches one by one, starting from the bottom and coming exactly towards me. My whole body frosted. I took a deep breath, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was some electrical problem, a short circuit. But the way the lights went out, always in the same time interval, seemed very calculated. I took my cell phone to use the flashlight, but before I could turn it on, another light bulb went out, and another one, getting closer and closer. The constant sound of the air conditioning also stopped, as if the power had been cut selectively, except for the lamp on the table where I was. That unique light illuminated a small circle around me, leaving everything else in an opaque darkness. I felt my heartbeat speeding up, my mouth dry. I couldn't see anything on the shelves around, only absolute pitch. That's when I realized something even more disturbing. I no longer heard the normal silence of the library. In the background, almost imperceptible, there was a slight sound, like slow steps approaching on the carpet. I held my cell phone tightly, but I hesitated to turn on the flashlight. Part of me didn't want to confirm what I already feared to see. The steps were too soft to be those of an employee, almost dragged, but constant, coming from some point to the left. I looked in that direction, but there was only darkness. With each step, my body became stiffer. The sound of the lights going out had stopped, the last one, well above me, still on. So, without warning, she blinked twice and turned off. I was completely in the dark. I switched on the cell phone flashlight in an impulse, illuminating the shelves in front of me. They were empty. I took a deep breath, trying to regain my calm, and that's when I realized all the books on the nearby shelves were slightly inclined in the same direction, pointing to where I was. When I took a step back, my foot touched something that wasn't there before, a book on the floor, half open. The cell phone light illuminated the page, and at the top, someone had written to the pen, "Come back." The air became heavy, and the feeling of being watched exploded inside me. I kept the book on impulse and started walking fast towards the exit, keeping the flashlight in front. As I advanced, I realized that the shelves formed a kind of natural corridor, narrowing my passage. At each step, he swore to listen to another, accompanying, but always a few meters behind. I didn't look back until I reached the door. When I went out to the illuminated corridor, the sound stopped immediately. I went into the gym just to catch a ball that had stayed there after physical education class. The lights were off, but the light that came in through the small high windows was enough for me to see the way to the warehouse. The echo of my steps sounded normal, until in the middle of the silence, I heard something that made me stop immediately, a muffled scream, as if someone was trying to call for help with their mouth covered. The sound came from the stands, which were completely empty. I looked up, fixing my eyes on the steps and darkest corners, but I didn't see anything moving. My whole body became tense, and my breathing accelerated. I tried to convince myself that it could have been some external noise, but that sound was human. It was very specific, as if the person was right there. I began to slowly climb the stands, feeling each step creaking under my feet. The gym seemed bigger and quieter with every step. When I got to the top, I stood still, looking at the empty space, trying to hear anything that confirmed that I wasn't imagining. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the distant sound of an old fan spinning on the ceiling. Then out of nowhere, the muffled scream came back, shorter this time, coming exactly under where I was. That part of the stands had a locked storage compartment, used to store equipment. The metal door was closed, but it looked like the sound was coming from inside. I approached, and only then did I realize that, through a crevice in the corner, a hot air came out of there, as if someone was breathing hard. My instinct told me to get out of there immediately, but my legs seemed stuck on the floor. I went to the stands as fast as I could, but without making much noise. At each step, I had the feeling that something was moving inside that compartment, as if someone was trying to change position in a tight space. I reached the floor and went straight to the side door of the gym, but I realized it was locked inside, which didn't make sense. I had entered through it myself minutes before. Silence suddenly returned, but this time it was different. Heavy, almost suffocating. I looked up and saw that all the lights in the gym were still on, except the one in the row where I was minutes before. There was only darkness, as if the lamp had burned at that moment. That's when I heard a metallic snack coming from the compartment, as if the lock had been forced inside. I went back up to the stands with my heart racing, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But when I got halfway, I noticed something that made me stop at the same moment. In the accumulated dust of the stands, there were hand marks, as if someone had crawled there on their stomach. They were recent, the dust was still loose around, and went towards the compartment below. I approached slowly, and, even before touching the door, a strong thud came from inside, as if something had fallen hard on the floor. At that moment, the instinct spoke louder. I ran to the main exit of the gym, pushing the door so hard that I hit the corridor wall. I never went back inside alone after that. The next day, when I commented with a friend who works on the cleaning team, he said that the gym had been locked since the previous afternoon, and that no one had entered there overnight. The strangest thing was when I asked if there was anything under the stands, he replied that that compartment had been empty for years, because the lock was broken inside. To this day, I have no idea what caused that muffled scream, nor how someone or something could be in there. I just know that, whenever I pass near the gym at night, I feel like something is still watching me from inside, waiting for me to approach again. I was in detention because I had arrived too late that morning. The rain outside hit the roof hard, and the constant sound even helped to pass the time. I was the only student there, sitting in the last row near the window, with the supervisor fiddling with papers on her desk. It was then that I noticed a different sound in the middle of the rain, dry, rhythmic beats against the glass. At first I thought it was some branch, but the rhythm was accurate, as if someone was marking time. I got up and went to the window. The courtyard was completely empty. There was no sign of movement, not even of someone moving away. The outside of the glass was wet, but without any clear mark where it could have come from. Still, I went back to my desk trying to ignore. Less than a minute later, the beats started again at the same pace, only stronger, as if they wanted me to open the window. I took a deep breath, and this time, I approached more slowly, trying to catch any movement outside. But what I saw made me more confused. The mud on the floor was intact, without footprints, with nothing to indicate that someone had come close to the window. The thin rain kept falling, but it was impossible for someone to leave there without leaving a trace. I went back to my desk, but I kept staring at the glass from the corner of my eye. The beats didn't come back immediately, only when the supervisor got up and went to the next room. As soon as I was completely alone, they started again, faster, almost impatient. It was as if the person, or whatever it was, knew I was alone and wanted my attention. When I got up to call the supervisor back, the knock stopped again. She entered the room, looked outside, and confirmed that there was no one in the courtyard. I even thought about letting it go, but a few minutes later, I heard the sound of something sliding on the glass, as if a wet hand had been passed through there. I went to the window with my heart racing and saw, marked in the condensation of the glass, a sharp hand shape. But what freezed me the most was not the size, which was bigger than mine, but the fact that the brand was inside the window. When I realized this, I took a few steps back, unable to take my eyes off the brand. The supervisor, who was still at the door, asked what it was, but I couldn't answer. She approached, saw what I was looking at, and was silent for a few seconds, as if she didn't know what to say either. She cleaned the glass quickly, maybe not to scare me anymore, but I got the feeling that it wasn't just a coincidence. To this day I can't understand how that hand appeared there, without anyone having entered the room. I remember exactly the day this happened, because it was one of the few moments at school when I really felt really scared. I had just arrived, put my backpack on the floor, and went to my closet as I always did. It was early, the corridor was still half empty, only a few students walking there. When I opened the door, I saw something folded on top of my books, something I definitely hadn't put there. I took the paper, and as I unfolded, I felt a chill rise up the back of my neck. It was written with a kind of hurried letter. "You shouldn't be here today." That's all. No signature, no explanation. I stood still looking at that, trying to remember if I had left my closet unlocked, but I always locked it. And the lock was not damaged, nor did it look like someone had forced the entrance. At the time, my first reaction was to look around to see if anyone was watching me, but the corridor seemed normal. Still, I felt that strange feeling that I had eyes on me. I put the note in my pocket and started scrolling the closet, trying to find some sign that someone has messed with my things. Nothing was out of place, but that only made the situation stranger, as if the person had been careful on purpose so that I wouldn't notice. I thought about showing it to some teacher, but at the same time I was afraid of looking paranoid. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Who knew what my closet number was? Who would have access to the key or the lock? And worse, what exactly did "I shouldn't be here today" mean? Was it just a stupid joke, or was someone really trying to warn me, or threaten? The rest of the day was impossible to focus on. Every time someone passed through the corridor, I looked quickly to see if I noticed any suspicious expression. I began to notice things that would normally go unnoticed. 2 students whispering near my desk, a teacher looking in my direction for longer than he should, and even the sound of footsteps getting slower when someone passed behind me. Everything seemed to gain a different weight after that note. When the last class was over, I waited for most to leave before going to the closet again. I opened it carefully, as if I expected to find another message inside. There was nothing, but I noticed that the door was slightly damp, as if someone had touched it with a wet hand just before. I looked at both sides of the corridor, completely empty, and felt my stomach freeze. There was no way to explain that without sounding crazy. I left school trying to act normally, but the feeling that someone was watching me didn't leave me even for a second. I looked back several times on the way home, and I swear that, for 2 moments, I thought I saw the same black silhouette in a sweatshirt on the opposite corner. It may have been a coincidence, but after turning a street and seeing the figure again, I felt my legs almost lock. When I got home, I locked the door and stayed in the living room trying to decide whether to tell someone. The ticket was still in the backpack. I took it to reread and noticed something I hadn't noticed before. In the lower corner, almost erased, there was a fingerprint mark made with something dark, maybe graphite or coal. To this day I don't know who left that, but whenever I open a closet, any closet, I feel that cold go up my spine. I worked in the early morning shift a short time ago, and had already decorated the sounds of the building. The click of the sensors, the blowing of the air conditioning, the click of the old carpet. It was 3:10 a.m. on my watch when I went up to check the corridor on the second floor, as always. The ward was all off, only the emergency lights making that faint glow on the doors. When turning in the meeting room, I noticed a strange reflection in the glass window of the door. It wasn't a lamp on. It looked like the brightness of the glass of something inside. I put my face on the display and saw the wall clock marking 3H17 nailed. I had removed his batteries myself a few days before because the minute pointer was crashing. The room was locked, with no sign of burglary or people circulating. Even so, I swear I felt that little dry tick noise low, as if it came from the wall. I took the key, opened it slowly, and entered with the flashlight leaning against my chest, so as not to burst light from the face. The room smelled of cleaning product and wax table, everything in order, chairs aligned, projector covered. I closed the door behind me by reflex, and went straight to the clock. I ran my finger through the battery compartment, empty the way I left it. I touched my ear without touching my forehead to the glass, and the tick became slightly sharper. I looked at my wrist, 3:13 a.m., advancing normally. I looked again at the wall clock. It was still at 3:17 a.m., as if the pointers moved without leaving the place. The watch lens was a little blurred inside, like breath caught. I got the annoying feeling that I had someone by my side, even though I was alone. I moved away a little, trying to reason. I thought about changing the clock to see if it was some magnetic field interfering. Any logical excuse was better than assuming that there was something strange going on. When I reached out to take it out of the wall, I felt the cold metal, much colder than the rest of the room. It wasn't an air conditioning temperature. It was like touching an object that was left in the freezer. I pulled slowly, but the support seemed to be locked, as if something was holding it inside. That's when, right in my ear, I heard a stronger, dry tick, and then absolute silence. So absolute that even the distant sound of the corridor air conditioning seemed to disappear. I took 2 steps back and felt that pressure in the air, as if the room had become smaller. I looked at the clock again, and the pointers were stopped at 3:17 a.m., but now the seconds pointer was pointing straight down, as if it had been displaced. The glass was still slightly blurred, but with circular marks on the inside, like lightly passed fingers. I left the room quickly, closed the door, and went downstairs without looking back. Later, reviewing the cameras, I saw that the moment I was in the room, the image showed the clock spinning at absurd speed, something I didn't see inside. To this day, when I pass that corridor near 3 in the morning, I feel the same cold on the back of my neck.